shaped by his mother's prayerful upbringing in Aza and his familial formation in Caleruega. Rooted in his studies begun at Gumiel and communal life in Osma, Dominic was immersed more fully in apostolic preaching as he served as a missionary priest in Fanjeaux and the surrounding countryside. Becaire notes that the region between Toulouse and Carcassonne was an indispensable corridor for travel and commerce in the Middle Ages, due to both its Roman roads and waterways. He further notes, at the beginning of the 13th century, the Toulouse-Carcassonne axis was one of heresy. Among the fortified townships of that region, Fanjeaux was a center of communication, well fortified and considered of great strategic importance for its location at a crossroads and its commanding view of the surrounding valleys. By the late 12th century, there were established houses of Catharists perfect in Fanjeaux and the surrounding townships, both for men and for women. It is believed that Dominic, along with Bishop Diego and Raoul of Fanjeaux, came to Fanjeaux as early as 1206, most likely choosing to pass through the strongholds of Albigensianism en route to Toulouse. Becaire notes that after the climb to the hill summit, just past the church and castle, Dominic would have seen the valley stretching far and wide. He somewhat poetically reflects on the heart of Dominic, who confronted with such a vista. The whole of the Lauragais was spread out before his eyes, this land which must be won back for Christ crucified. Dominic was certainly present and active in that region in 1207. The public disputation with the Albigensians, in which he participated with Bishop Diego and Raoul to represent the Catholic teaching, was held in April 1207. Blessed Jordan attests that Dominic's reply to the questions disputed was chosen to represent the Catholic position. An account of a witness of the disputation, Pierre de Vaucernay, relates that Dominic's summary of points was cast into the fire 3 times and yet remained unharmed. Whether the strength of the arguments therein or the accompanying sign of the document's preservation proved more convincing to individuals, there is no doubt that Dominic's testimony won converts to the Catholic faith. That very month, Dominic was given a donation to support the project of establishing a community for women converted by his preaching. The traditions found in manuscripts at Prouilhe recount that in July, notably on the feast of St. Mary Magdalene, Dominic saw a globe of fire over Prouilhe. This vision, known as the Seigneur d'Eau, and commemorated by a cross-topped monument in Fanjeaux, confirmed for the holy preacher that the foundation of the monastery for the women converted by God's grace, mediated by his preaching, would be established in that very place. In Prouilhe stood a church once designated as a parish and dedicated to Our Lady. By the time Dominic saw the sign, the church was attached to the parish of Fanjeaux and was in bad repair. The parish priest of Fanjeaux allowed the preachers the use of the church, where their celebration of Mass and Divine Office drew Catholic believers together. The use of the building and surrounding lands by the preachers was confirmed by Bishop Folk. In early 1207, the women's community was small and some lived in Fanjeaux. Bishop Diego, as head of the preaching band, appointed Dominic as the spiritual director of the nuns and William Claret as the director of temporal affairs. Bishop Diego left for Osma in September of 1207, intending to return as soon as he could to Prouilhe. But as he prepared for the return journey in December, he fell ill and died on December 30th. In Prouilhe, by November 22nd, the sisters had gathered together at Sainte Marie de Prouilhe, and a more structured enclosure had been established by December. As the year 1208 opened, Dominic received in Prouilhe the news of the death of his bishop and missionary companion for the past 10 years, and within 3 weeks, the news of the assassination of Peter of Castelnau, the papal legate fearlessly preaching the Catholic faith in the walled town of Carcassonne, where Dominic himself would preach a Lenten retreat in 1213. Raoul had already died, the third papal legate was away, and the Cistercian preachers had returned to their abbeys. Thus the realization of Diego's dream and the formation of the fledgling monastery of nuns and band of preachers fell to Dominic. Although certainly saddened by the loss of his spiritual father, Dominic had the family of sisters and brothers in Prouilhe as his support. From the beginning, the prayer and sacrifice of the nuns was a stable and fruitful font of grace for the preaching apostolate of the brothers, much like the ministry of the holy women who served the apostolic preaching in the time of Christ. Dominic remained preaching in Fanjeaux and Prouilhe throughout the tumultuous years following the personal loss of Diego and of the political instability of the region caused by the Albigensian crusade under Simon de Montfort. By 1212, the mendicant group had sufficient funds to build a monastery to the side of the church in Prouilhe. The life of the first nuns was modeled on that of the Cistercians until 1216, when the nuns received a rule based on that approved for the friars' preachers. Even though the early community faced great poverty and threats of closure, by the time of Blessed Jordan its endurance had proven firm, and he wrote words true also today. The house still exists. The servants of God continue to offer an agreeable worship to their Creator there, and lead in zealous sanctity and the pure light of their innocence a life which is salutary to themselves, exemplary to other men, pleasing to the angels and agreeable to God. The life of Dominic in Fanjeaux cannot be considered apart from his solicitude for the sisters in Prouilhe. The disputation in which he defended the faith preceded and helped to motivate the foundation of the monastery of Sainte Marie de Prouilhe, and his establishment of residence in Fanjeaux was not only due to his appointment as parish priest in May of 1214, but also in order to have a base for preaching and to serve the needs of the nuns. There, tradition tells us, he lived with companions in a small house near the church and the Seigneur. In the center of the house, now named for St. Dominic, the oldest wall and a fireplace of the 13th century connect a modern pilgrim to the time of Dominic. This room now holds an altar and stained glass windows to commemorate the time Dominic spent in the small town.
There is another reason why this well is important. It is said to be provided by the tears of Saint Dominic, and it is really some sort of parable. Saint Dominic was crying during nights in prayer, asking to God to save the sinners, and he was full of compassion, full of mercy. The fountain was in Saint Dominic's eye itself, so he had in himself an unquenchable spring of compassion for the sinners. It is something which is very characteristic also of the Dominican charisma, because you see, you can enlighten the souls, but if you do not change the hearts, it will be totally useless. But the moving of the will, it is not our power to do it, it is God's power to do it. It means that in an apostolic order, such as the Dominicans, there are required both preachers who teach the truth of faith, of course, but in this apostolic order are also required people who pray God to move the will of the sinners. The contemplative nuns of the Dominican order are completely apostolic, even if they do not preach by themselves, but they preach by their intercession to God to convert the sinners.
Tradition consistently affirms that Dominic frequently walked the steep, winding path between Fanjeaux and Prouilhe, a tangible reminder of the deep and necessary link between the prayerful life of the monastery in the valley and the arduous apostolic preaching upon the hill. Vicaire reflects, up in Fanjeaux again, while he worked at the labor of converting a town that was relentless in its hostility, or while he continued his long prayers in the church, he could hear, ringing in the distance day and night, the bells of the nuns of Prouilhe calling to prayer, and the sound gave him courage. Although the physical monastery of Saint-Marie de Prouilhe was destroyed during the French Revolution, the life of prayer and holy preaching established by St. Dominic and his followers has not been destroyed. In Prouilhe today, one part of the original monastery and chapel remains, the keystone bearing the image of the Lamb of God, the Agnus Dei, symbolic of Jesus Christ slain for sinners but triumphant in love. The present church and monastery date to the 19th century during the restoration of the Order of Preachers in France under Henri Dominique Lacadère, and there is a current project for restoration of the basilica, which has become increasingly visited as a font of Dominican life and spirituality, as well as a spiritual destination along the pilgrimage route to Compostela. The period of over 10 years that Dominic spent in the Midi of France held the birth of the Order of Preachers, and is the period from which many of the testimonies came for his canonization. These years were marked by both sound spiritual and legislative laying of foundations for the sisters and brothers, and intense apostolic preaching. The roads between Fanjeaux and the neighboring regions were the place of Dominic's walking barefoot through the thorns, singing the Veni Creator Spiritus and Ave Maris Stella as he went from town to town preaching the Gospels. The path between Fanjeaux and Prouilhe was worn by his paternal love for the order, and holds the memorial of the attack which he hoped would procure for him the honor of martyrdom for the sake of Jesus Christ. In 1215, Dominic would relocate to Toulouse, the capital city of that region, to live in community with the growing band of preachers gathered in the former home of Peter Sala. From Toulouse, he would send out the brothers, 2 by 2, to preach Christ far beyond the beautiful valley where the Order of Preachers was born, and where the prayers that sustain it have continued for these 8 centuries. In that city, in the Church of the Jacobins, would eventually be the resting place of St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous of the sons of Dominic. From the holy preaching, born in the valley of Prouilhe, would indeed spring a family numerous and widespread, a family called, like its father, to be a light in the church as preachers of truth.